Right, so let's kick off the discussion with, I'm guessing, an assumption, we'll see if you agree with me, that data is now critical to organisations when it comes to running your business. You kind of need to know what's going on. But does this importance actually shake through to senior leadership? And in which case, do they know how to use it? Or, if I'm a CEO, do I need to know how to use it? Or do I have people for that? What do you think?
I think the answer is definitely yes. But looking after data, you would imagine so. And I think the importance at Thames Water, we work in 5-year cycles. And actually one of our key strategic goals over the next 5 years is to improve how we manage our customer data for their benefit, for our benefit, and for the environment. And that's actually one of our critical pillars across the entire business. So actually, yeah, we think it's pretty important.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, Christina, working in publishing and news, I've also been working there myself. So, we monitor things straight away. It seems like data's been highly critical for that as well. Do people beyond editors, the people who are running the businesses, pay as much attention as well as they do on the news floor?
Yes, absolutely. So the marketing teams are fully bought into propensity models, using data to try and drive their acquisition or churn statistics. The commercial teams are using data to really try and target the right customers at the right times. And editorial, obviously, using data in the newsroom for insight. I think in publishing, it's really important, though, to remember that editorial judgment is part of the journalistic process, and not to completely rely on data. So the editorial teams are informed by data, but not driven by data.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So it's acting as it informs a creative outlet in that way.
Yes, and I think the way we look at data is it allows people to make better decisions, but isn't the only tool. So we expect people to also be using other indicators and not just looking at the data.
Okay, so Pankaj, I know you work in machine learning, and highly technical area of expertise for many people. How much do you feel that C-suite needs to understand exactly the full scope of what you're doing, or are there ways to explain machine learning and data in relative terms without losing the accuracy?
I think so, yes. So a couple of things. I think there's a lot of focus at the C-suite in terms of really understanding the value of data, and then looking to see how that can actually help organizations becoming data-driven. So I think that sort of top-down focus in terms of value is really important. And I think we're seeing an interesting sort of shift in terms of organizations thinking about data products, services, and experiences. So I think that's quite important. And then from a machine learning perspective, I think the role of the machine learning folks and the data scientists has changed. Increasingly, we're looking at folks that have got domain experience. So looking at what business problems can be solved, what are the opportunities from data, and then how can sort of data science, machine learning be applied to actually create those products, services, and insight. So we're seeing quite a lot of sort of subtle shifts in this space.
Mm-hmm. And so bringing this into your area, Paul, banking,
Yeah.
Data seems to be something that is not only transformative for your business area, but also something that the public are highly aware of, and they like to keep an eye on, and because obviously your bank knows everything about you in a way, they can be very revealing. So do you have to work across teams, I guess? Is there security as well as C-suite management as well as technical ability? It seems like a lot will actually feed into what you're doing today.
Yeah, I think that banks by definition are data companies, because as a business we run data every day in terms of not only the compliance data, but especially all the data that we have around customer interactions and what customers are doing with their current accounts and products. So for us is how we move from using data just to make the business more efficient, to provide value to the customer, and how we can use the data that we already have, but also the data that we can collect from the customer interactions to help customers every day with their money. And there is lots of things that we can do, combining data with machine learning to easily help people predict things that will happen in a week or two in their current accounts, and making the life of customers easier. But the thing for me is you need to bring a different way of thinking into those customer needs and understand how you can use really data to transform the traditional services that we provide today. And I think that for banking is how you move from information to knowledge, and how you can use the data to provide much more contextual information to your customers.
Mm-hmm. And so with such a huge amount of data incoming from different applications to different forms of banking. How do you manage this? I mean, what are the kind of frameworks that need to be acknowledged? I mean, it sounds like a huge role to deal with a lot of data and a lot of different kinds of data. Do you feel there's a sort of management understanding that it's not just big data, as it was put fashionably a few years ago, or that in fact there's going to be a certain amount of complexity and cost when it comes to managing this data?
It's more a transformation of the organization, so it's moving from big data teams that are more probably the technical enablers to allow you to manage much more volumes of data, to having a data culture within the company. So for us is, when you think about the critical functions in the business, wherever it's marketing, wherever it's legal, IT, is how you bring that data culture in the organization and make sure that data is the first thing that you discuss in terms of building new products and services. So on one side, you have the technical enablers, so you need big data teams to provide infrastructure. But on the other side, you need to have a proper data culture that allows you to make sure that when you are thinking about launching a new product to the market, you are thinking with data as the starting point to create new products and services.
So I know that data sharing is something that you have an interest in, and when there is an overwhelming amount of data from so many different sources, what would be a solution? What are you looking forward to when it comes to trying to work out how to bring different data groups together in order to make them more useful?
I think actually it's not about big data, it's about small data and the right questions. And one of the things I would also say is that obviously a lot of what we do is around engineering and building stuff, and actually having standards and having common standards to be able to share. But I think also, we've last 18 months, a lot of companies have gone through their GDPR transformations and are more wary about sharing information. But there are other companies, for example, like Transport for London, who are openly sharing their data and moving much more towards that open data sharing, a sort of collaboration point of view. And if you look at our industry, one of the things that we work in is, as I say, the 5-year cycles. And actually, our regulator has said, you have to collaborate and we want you to innovate. And actually, going back to, I think, your point, Christina, it's not about necessarily, it's about data. And we all talk about big data and how we manipulate it. It's about creating information which allows insight, which allows better actions to be taken based on trusted information.
Do you worry about, because small data sets are great, but to get the small data sets, you often have to collect everything to work out which of the small data sets that are useful. So do you do any, I mean, obviously we've all got GDPR compliance and other ethic considerations. So do you worry about how much data you collect and the purpose of collecting the data, or do your companies collect the data and work out?
Well, again, if I look at what we've done is we've moved now towards using explanations, and we either use Lego or we use a Rubik's Cube. So the Rubik's Cube has got 6 different dimensions of data that we collect around customers, colleagues, place, assets, and so on. And then what we've then introduced is this idea of data families. So what's the critical information that I need to know about you as a customer? I need to know your name, where you live, probably how much you pay and how much you consume. And then you then can start to join smaller bits of information together and then focus on the quality and then start to expand it out. And I think that's common across, but when you then want to share that across industry, to like the gas industry or the electricity or the telecoms industry, they might collect different things and might be different important to them. So I think having some common standards across sectors is going to become more and more important. So we can actually share information for good and use techniques to anonymize it.
I think that adding to the question is, I think that the challenge for me is more the quality than the quantity. So it's not about the quantity of data you collect, it's are you collecting the right data to provide the right services to your customers, no?
Yes.
And there are small things that you can do. For example, in banking, you can collect geolocation data when you're doing a transaction to help your customers understand better how they are spending money, in the same way that when you do a transaction with Apple Pay, you can see instantly the Google map of where you have done that transaction. It's making sure that you are collecting the quality information that then will allow you to provide better customer experience on top of that data.
And I think that's the challenge, because we think a lot about privacy by design, and actually what's the purpose, should we be collecting it, and what's the purpose of having that data?
Yeah.
And then when you obviously look at, companies like Google who have vast amounts of data about everything we do, you begin to think, well, actually, do you want someone to have quite that much information about you?
Yeah.
It's a really interesting problem.
So, Christina, do you see that maybe along the lines of a kind of battle for convenience? So whether or not people have got this sort of, I think you've mentioned it before, a hierarchy of needs as well, sort of, will they need banking? Probably. Do humans need water? Yes. Do I need to read this news story? Depends on how many cookies it's going to throw at me. People are becoming more aware about the trade-offs that they have, but also, you still need to run a business to make money.
My perception is that people aren't actually as aware as they probably should be, because data is really valuable. Your personal data is really valuable, and particularly if I look at my kids, they'll give their data about them to anybody, anything for any freebie, and so I think that I don't think yet people are necessarily educated. I think it's happening, and people are beginning to think more before they give personal information, but I don't think generally people are as educated as they probably need to be about actually it is of value to companies, that's why they want it, and actually what is the exchange you're getting, and is that exchange enough value?
Okay. And so, Pankaj, to run machine learning, you need a lot of data to have a nice selection of things. How much do you think is described to either customers when they may be generating data as to what it's used for? How much that can you explain? Or do you think there might be a shift now to things like connected enterprise? So it's going to be internal machine data generated, say, by an industrial line. Is that more useful? And in which case you don't have to explain to the robot that you're taking its data. So is that easier?
So I think there's two sets of questions there. One is just in terms of the amount of data that are collected for maybe more conventional sort of machine learning related problems. Now, one of the things we do when we work with our clients is looking at really the explainability of some of the data and also some of the rights to use the data. So I think one of the key concepts is the notion of creating a data marketplace that says for a given data set, what are some of the privacy and usage controls that come alongside it? And when we're actually aggregating data, maybe for example, for some of the machine learning models, do we have the rights to actually aggregate at the right level and so forth? So I think that an explainability also as part of being able to outline why the machine learning model is given a certain recommendation is important for that traceability. So I think that's one focus that lets us deal with the volumes of data, but with the rights to use. And then I think on the other side, with sort of some of the data being collected at the edge, well, oftentimes that is not PII data. And I think to one of the points you were mentioning earlier, what are the right standard protocols to actually be able to ingest and process that data? That's where some of the complexity lies. So what's interesting is I think whilst the tech's really, really good there now to actually be able to ingest data, whether it's streaming, micro batch, I think some of the common data management disciplines about data descriptions, data catalogs, data standards is starting to re-emerge, which I think sort of lost traction when there was this whole honeymoon period with big data. It was all about the tech. I think data management now, data privacy security is going back in a massive way.
So we talked about making sure that people in leadership understand why this is important, and as you say, how it's moved on from the big data explosion from a buzzword into a tool that's going to be highly relevant and useful to leaders who are running businesses. Is there an ability to then run this down through teams? There may be people who are resistant, say in the banking field, who say, well, actually, my job's not necessarily about processing huge amounts of data. Why should I be interested? How do you educate and inform teams throughout an organisation, Paul? And do you need to?
I think that you need to spread that data culture everywhere. So I think we are doing a lot about training people about understanding what data means and how they can use data better in their everyday jobs. And it can be around, people that is in the legal department, how they can use data better to understand the new regulations, and machine learning also to learn about what those regulations means. So I think that you need to do a general knowledge of data, and then you need to think specifically about what each business area requires in terms of using data to manage their areas of responsibility better. No? And I think we are starting a lot on marketing. I think it's critical in terms of how you can transform the marketing function through data. That it's lots also around reporting and compliance and how you can use data better. And the other thing for us is customer facing. So how can you transform your existing products and services through data? So we are doing small things around how we can help people understand that if they don't do something on their accounts in a week or two, they can become overdraft because there will be a direct debit coming into their account. So there are small things that you can do to start transforming your customer experience through data. And using the data, we already have to provide a better service to our customers.
Okay, and so, Russ, if I turn up with an organisation like Thames Water and tell everybody in a company-wide email they're all going to use big data, are they going to reject that? They're like, how do you change a culture to make them realise that at all levels, maybe, that this kind of information processing or data should be important to them, maybe?
I think it comes back to a lot around accuracy. And actually, if you can have a line back to your customers who you're trying to serve, I think that's really important. And I think, whether we are in the field and we record the fact that we've worked on a pipe can have an impact on whether or not there's going to be burst there in the future. So I think actually a lot of it changing the culture of again, rather than data is information, is actually about understanding the consequences of having information that's not good or not stored or gaps. And I think that comes back to a lot more about what we're trying to do at the moment is actually look at the data quality and then having the data standards and actually looking at the completeness of information about records. And then how does each individual play a role in improving when they have a phone call with a customer that says, oh yeah, I remember, let me just check if I've got your phone number. It needs to become part of scripts, but actually it needs to be just part of the DNA of what we do and how we do it.
I think we're seeing a lot of traction also in this term of data literacy, which is about actually, if you look at different personas in the organization, how is data going to be relevant for them? So there's been a lot of buzz about, for example, self-service data tools, but actually, how do you combine domain insight and, let's say, experience with what the data is telling you? And how do you actually enable the different personas, whether it's at the customer-facing touch points, whether it's somebody who's doing the machine learning models, to actually interface with the right tools and use the data for them to be effective in their jobs. So I think that data culture, data literacy, and looking at personas and sort of roles and how data can be relevant for them is getting, again, a lot of traction.
And I think we've really shifted from having quite a siloed data team that was very much a technology team sat to one side to actually really federating the people out, but also getting slightly different people. So it's more like the data translators who can understand the business needs, but also understand the capability of the data. And I think that's really important because actually I think more and more a lot of the data science capability, is being produced by Google and other people that we take advantage of. And the key skill really is the people who are able to understand what the business is trying to do and understand the capabilities and marry the two. And I think the other thing that the way we kind of tried to spread the knowledge and train people up is we just had really good data advocates in different areas where we worked and showed wins. And then people start going, oh, that's interesting. And then they kind of want to learn because they see that actually how it's worked in another part.
Do you think that has an impact on things like editorial standards? Obviously, it's great if you've written something fabulously great, insightful story, which is, to the cause of J-Score, sort of like for the public, to have something revealed and, that they can think about. But writing for statistics is a little bit of a cold shoulder to the sort of ethic of writing journalism for noble reasons. However, it's writing for statistics that pays the wage in the end. So how do you bring that enthusiasm for data in without tipping it over into something where you're going to find writers saying, well, maybe this story is not as exciting to the public and I want to change it?
So I think first we've shifted from how many people read an article, which were the simple data tools that the newsrooms had initially, to looking at a much more complex, for this type of story in the position it was on the site at the time of day it was published, our expectations it would behave in this way and it would be this popular, which is a bit better because actually it's all relative, because if you're the top story you're going to get a lot of traffic. And then I think we're also beginning to think around customer engagement and how many, it's just the engagement with, so it might be a few customers but they're highly engaged with that content, which is really important. And so I think that we have evolved in terms of the insight, but also the editorial teams are paid for their understanding of what's important and presentation of the news. I mean, that's why people subscribe to the Times. And so you can't have it completely data-driven, or, what's the biggest driver of traffic? Because you would get certain stories that have huge traffic, but actually are probably not the most important.
Okay. So Ross, do you see data changing the shape of things? I mean, obviously people need water in their homes and to their businesses. But in working with big data, does it throw up any surprises about, say, something that we think we know? We think we know why we need water.
I think what it can do, I mean, we've recently looked at where can we get information from, and if I look at South London alone, we get something in the region of about 2.8 million alarms a day within that geography. And trying to sift through the difference between what's an alarm and an event that something is going to break if we don't do something, that's where I think the machine learning and the algorithms and the understanding come about criticality. And I think one of the things that's really going to make a difference over the coming years is being able to connect assets, whether they be banking assets, ATMs, whether they, all of the stuff that we collect, is actually understanding what's critical information rather than nice to have. In the same way that you protect your assets, if you miss 3 or 4 times of fixing them, then they're going to break. One of the things that we found recently is, for example, if we don't replace all of our plastic pipes in a geography, it's 5 times more likely that the cast iron is going to burst. We didn't have the evidence for that until really recently. And hence the reason why recently we've announced that we're looking to replumb London. So I think data and information used in the right way and having hypotheses that you're trying to disprove or prove with good data and good quality data. I mean, with 3 bits of data, you can triangulate a really good piece of insight. You don't need thousands unless you're starting to get to scale where, we've got 28,000 acoustic loggers that listens for leaks every night. Having that information is vital for us to be able to make sure that we can fix stuff. And I think this is where it comes into what's the outcome and what's the things that we're trying to do at the end, and have that kind of system thinking and design thinking and actually working backwards. If that's my end goal, what do I need to collect here? And what's the quality? If it's 90% right here and 90% right here, then there's a degradation of the information that means I make a poorer decision. So you need to understand where the critical points are within your process, I think, especially with an engineering business, very much around that. It's around quality, it's around process, it's around people, it's about having the right culture, and it's around having governance and standards.
I fully agree. And I think one of the other interesting sort of concepts is also sort of encouraging different users and personas to contribute data sets back once they've actually added insight. I think one of the things I've often observed is, different sort of, let's say, machine learning teams will maybe create a data set, maybe create some features, but oftentimes the benefit of that hasn't been fed back in for broader use. So actually, how do you create the culture of reuse and almost promote backwards in to actually then create a data marketplace and culture of collaboration? So I think that's another sort of concept that's taking hold as well.
Pankaj, out of interest, when your teams generate different forms of data, so not the primary source necessarily, where do you feel accountability comes in for that? Does that become the ownership of the people who've created that data, or does it trace back to the people who maybe committed that in the first place? Because you end up in a very complex area, and when it comes to things, I mean, we mentioned here things like GDPR. That's your kind of front line of legal accountability, but it does get quite complicated quite quickly.
Correct. I think there's 2 very important sets of bookends that actually help there. One is if, for example, we're looking to progress with the data science use case, it is backed up by a product owner that says, actually, there is a hypothesis we want to prove, or it's an exploratory use case with this kind of a limit in terms of what we would prove. And then from a governance perspective, that's backed with what are the sort of sources of data that are going to be utilized, what are the golden sources, and what are the rights to use the data. So that kind of collaboration happens upfront, and that actually leads to, what are the levels of aggregates we can bring in, and when the data are being utilized, how is the output going to be consumed? So for example, if the insight can be done at let's say a segment level, that's fine, but perhaps we can't use the targeting at an individual level. So as we actually build our sort of machine learning models, besides looking at things like bias in the data sets, we've also got some audit processes in place that say, well, once the output is being consumed, how does it marry up with what the rights to use are? And the product owner has to sign off on it before we can deploy. So I think there's checks and balances through the process that let you sort of control how the outputs are going to be consumed. And this is where we've had to work a lot with our data science teams, because sometimes there's an excitement in, well, let me find the best fit model or technique. But then also in terms of the usability, we need the product owner and the business sort of sponsors to really sort of put the right guardrails around.
And do you find that most companies have one person who's ultimately responsible for data governance and people sticking to policies? Or do you find that actually you should federate it out? It
is federated out. And I think one of the interesting shifts in terms of sort of, let's say, the CDO sort of role or data governance is, rather than it being used as a policy function, actually turn it on its head and lend itself to business value. So for example, rather than trying to prescribe a data catalog just from, let's say, a GDPR perspective, it's more, data scientists can actually look at raw or curated data sets or actually sort of model catalogs. So if we actually sort of use that business value lens to drive some of the data governance initiatives, and I think one of the things I picked up from your discussions, if you've then got, like, say, a data science use case that has had good success with the business, that creates a bit of a buzz. So it's almost like, ground up to actually get that sort of buy-in, which traditionally has been quite hard, and it's often a dry topic, but it's getting a lot of traction now.
Excellent. So I wanted to ask also, Paul, you talked about the development of product through data, and also you mentioned things that I actually personally like, because I'm a banking idiot and I love my app because it tells me when money's going in and out, which I wouldn't necessarily been great at tracking before.
Yeah.
Do you think we're at a stage yet where, there's a certain amount of experimentation has to take place in order to find out if a product works? And society's very aware now, more broadly, that we're using data to do this. But do you think that maybe we're a little bit critical still when something goes wrong? These are the apps that, like, the minute we find out this is going to make my life easier, it's the best thing since sliced bread. The minute it goes wrong, it's terrifying, it's going to make headlines. Do you think there's enough affordance in working with data when it's such a sensitive subject still, when people are still unsure about what they're giving and where it goes, before it becomes something that then they want? Do you think we're forgiving enough?
I think that there are like different questions there. No? So one thing is how you experiment with customers and make sure that what you are designing for them it's something meaningful. No? And if you look at banking and regulation, there is lots of sandbox and things that allows you to experiment with real data and real customers. So on one side, you can use control environments to start piloting those solutions with your customers and make sure that the data you are capturing and then you are using back to provide value to the customer makes sense, because you need to refine those models and make sure that that information works for the different type of personas or customers. So experimentation is something that we do, and the regulation allows you to do that. And then on the other side, it's how you use not only the data you have, but also through open banking and other open data sets, that combination of information where you can help your customers in a better way. No? So for us, it's more about you need to be very transparent with people when you're experimenting something new, and we have that environment that allows us to tell in a very transparent way to customers saying, well, this is a new service, we are going to be inviting you to experiment with this service, and the data we're going to be capturing and sharing with you is going to be refined through feedback and making sure that that works. No? So, and as you said, people is expecting apps to work every day when they use those apps, but if you involve customers in the design and experimentation process, we are seeing lots of people engage in that process of helping companies like banks design new services. No? And we're seeing that also outside of banking. So there are lots of, in Google Maps, you can experiment every day new features that they are testing, and you can provide feedback through that those applications and help them improve new features.
Did the traditional banks see the open banking regulation as a good or bad thing?
I think that open banking is something that will help the customer for sure, because it's allowing people to use that data everywhere. No, it's a challenge for traditional banks in the way that you have to change your technological platform to be able to provide data in a secure way. But we're seeing lots of also traditional banks taking advantage of open banking to provide a better service. No? So for us, for example, is how we can use open banking to accelerate the process of opening up a new account if you already have an account in another bank, because you can use open banking data to speed up that onboarding journey. So there are lots of things that banks can do, taking advantage of existing data. No? And at the same time, this is allowing new innovation to come to the market because there are non-financial apps that are using banking data to provide also service around money and your financial data. No? So I think it's opening up more competition and more innovation for customers.
It sounds like a situation you'd look forward to.
Yeah.
All right then, well, I'm going to wrap things up here for now, but thank you very much to the panel for joining me. It's been a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.